Has everyone got a particularly awkward question?
in a fuzzy supportive sort of
In a fuzzy supportive
way.
kind of way. You can see a show of hands of who's got questions.
Well, I'm raising you.
1, 2, 3. Yeah? Go for it.
Oh, you go.
I had one interesting thing, anecdotally from what I do, is that the nature of how people engage with each other in communities, and then how they engage with representatives within the local community. And are you looking at the impact and the fluidity of how people can engage, whether it be through Twitter, all those different mediums, and is that having an impact? So I know you said you're referring to newspapers, which is quite a traditional form of gathering research. Yeah, there are many different ways where people can actually pressurise and try and influence the debate.
I mean, the first two that we started, I mean, the advantage in newspapers is you can circumscribe the sort of, the corpus becomes quite clear, and it's still certainly, I mean, I'd feel reasonably comfortable in saying that it's actually quite a good snapshot of, you're going to find pretty usefully the character of that discourse. I mean, you've got a lot of statements about of quite diverse statements about why people object or why people are in favour of intensification.
My instinct is I would disagree with that.
One point to make, I think, that probably is I think you might be right that if I was in the UK, I might be more inclined to agree with you. But the newspapers there's no national newspaper at all. So the local papers are actually much more substantial things than probably Manchester accepted, but than the most local papers would be in the UK. They pay a lot of journalists. I mean, the Ottawa Citizen has a pretty substantial number of journalists on the roster. It's not like you can get anything published in those because they're desperate for copy all the time, which certainly when I was living in the UK it was dead easy to get stuff published in the local papers because, oh, fantastic, column inches. So I think that's probably a sort of social organisation of the media that makes a certain effect. I mean, it's obviously very clear. Yes, it's going to be the case that there's a lot of filtering going on in terms of what gets reported and what doesn't get reported, and that's part of the reason for looking directly at community association newsletters as well. Direct calls from Twitter would be, you would get less filtering. But it's not like they don't have their own biases in terms of who would be talking. I
look at Facebook, and Facebook I know is where I live, and there's been particular campaigns exactly on
putting a building up
very close to this, or removing the civic space and things like that, actually putting a big clump of carbon on it, and they've been extremely successful, and they've used traditional mediums like newspapers, but that wasn't their starting point to engage or to start the fight.
The other way into that, which would be a hunt. Partly talking to people in the community newsletter, saying, do you use Facebook or how do you communicate this stuff? The other thing would be, what would be the case now, which you see at least since for the last 4 years or so, that you see the traditional media reporting what's going on Facebook itself. So you might, but that would be that would mean focusing the search on the more recent, let's say from 2010 or 11 onwards at the most. Well, you wouldn't see that in 2002, obviously, but partly it's designed to be manageable to start with, and it depends on what we find there, whether we would expand that out. But I think, you're absolutely right that if we found that we were clearly missing certain types of activities. One thing, for example, would be interesting would be on the, I don't know if it would be interesting, but where that I would expect that to occur a lot would be around the stuff on campus, because there is a lot of stuff in that ward. That Sandy Hill was one of the neighbourhoods I mentioned. do get a very clearly sort of identity-oriented campaign that they don't want more students living in the neighbourhood. And so you've got the mayor, for example, saying, "Oh, you can, students get a U-pass. They get a subsidised bus pass. Blah blah blah. They can live anywhere in the city." So there's a sort of rhetorical strategy. But I'm assuming there that you've got that. I mean, there is a Sandy Hill Residents Association group which is very active on that. It's called Action for Sandy Hill, and they presumably do some of that via Facebook, but they also do a lot of it via the traditional. They just turn up at council meetings and lobby, and so they're fairly visible even without looking at Facebook. I'll bet that, yeah. I mean, I mean, if I'm honest, it's partly always being, it's always that sort of, there'd be a million places I could look for it, but that tendency is one to keep the research manageable as well.
Could you just say your name and if you want your institutional affiliation, but you don't have to, when you ask your question?
No, that
was you were. That was a right.
Okay.
Moving along to the gentleman in the yellow top.
Okay. Kevin Freer. No institutional affiliation, but I'm involved in a number of community energy projects, energy saving and generation. And what struck me as you were talking, and I was kind of wanting to know more about, does it change depending on what how much it's a project of the community rather than imposed on the community? So people's attitudes to wind turbines, for example, will be completely different if they're getting no benefit from them and can see that a private company is compared to if actually the community decides to put a wind turbine somewhere for their own benefit, including income. And that actually, as well, part of the process is a real engagement in what do people want from their neighbourhood and a real engagement in that kind of planning, whether that's been looked at and makes a difference.
The planning cultures across North America are, in my experience, radically different on that score, and that they have very, very little. They have a lot of consultative processes but on the building side. Well, no, even on the energy side, because I'll come to the energy bit in a minute, there is a project I want to do on community energy generation, which would be more along those lines. All new buildings are essentially just proposed by private developers. And all the planners ever do is passively say, this is zoned for such and such a type of development, and this is zoned for that, and this is zoned for that. There's basically no strategic planning in the active sense at all. And so part of the thing, I mean, I expected to find more of this. I mean, you find it in the sort of the sort of left strategy of opposition that I outlined a little bit. But I mean, I think it's certainly a general statement that's true that a lot of the reason that people get upset is going to be in part because there is no buy-in. But that's a feature of all development in the city at all. So it's not unique to these sorts of developments either. You'll find the same opposition to people building on the greenfield, on the edge of the city. The same rationales. Those bastard developers are building on our greenfield lands. The developers own all the greenfield lands because that's their strategy for making money. But that's nevertheless the same. That lack of control is, if you like, a structural condition underpinning why people might object to all sorts of developments, but it doesn't explain the specificity of why they would object to low carbon developments and so much. If that makes sense. On the energy side, I think there is an interesting one where, because we have a feed-in tariff now in Ontario as well, and they also changed the regulation about energy co-ops. So we've now got an Ottawa Union City, and it's across the province, Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op, and they are starting now to do all these quite interesting projects. They've just put solar roofs on the whole of a high school, and integrated it into the curriculum, physics curriculum and stuff, industry. So there's on that side, I think you can claim that there's more openness for community-oriented projects than on the building side itself. And there's no community planning stuff that you see in a lot of British and European cities at all, or strategic planning by a city authority. Yeah.
Next question.
Mine's such a comment for everybody locally as a question to you. I'm Maggie Walker, I've done all sorts of things, currently a student at MMU. In the early part of your talk about the cultural, political economy and so on, rather than the intensification bit, we had the experience in the city of the congestion charge being put forward and debated, strong local government and central government support for it, but it failed, and it failed on, I believe, a lot of these reasons that people fully supported the idea that cars should be controlled, but in no way were they going to be charged for taking their car into their city, and that sort of thing. And I've had a conversation only in the last couple of weeks with somebody who's an environmental health officer who was quite openly telling me, and of course I voted against that congestion charge, I just work on air pollution, and I think, I just wonder whether there's similar sort of works being done, anybody knows, done around that issue here, because there seem to be quite a lot of parallels with you having chosen intensification as your topic within Ottawa.
It's a question to everyone, not just to Matthew. I think it's really good. The congestion charge is a brilliant case to put alongside there. Thank you. More questions?
Well, I think maybe the analytical question, the analytical implication of this to you, Matthew. So what is surprising of the findings, particularly around the discursive struggle around intensification? Because I would agree that the arguments that you presented seem very familiar, either on congestion charge or greenfield. So is there anything specific around the struggles, or surprising around the struggles of densification for green reasons? So it seems, I was just wondering, what is analytically interesting from this, apart from the specifics of the case? Is there any, or if the struggle is always the same, then that's interesting in itself. If that's that it's always the same kind of cultural tropes and discursive rhetorics that are being used.
I think the thing that's well, the one thing that I do want to explore, I don't know if I would call it a surprise. Not I don't know if it's a surprise as such, but I think it's the way more not necessarily the analytic side on its own, but as I do some of this research with local NGOs and local activists and with people in the city as well, is to make them think about that ambivalence point more, because they tend to want to set it up in terms of two nice neat choices between either two interest groups or or just becoming actually dealing with our emissions full stop, as if there's no dilemma there. And so I think that's where that's the point that I would want to bring out of that. That's not necessarily purely academic. I'd be quite happy if the academic side of it just becomes a nice, rich case study that other people can go off and read and use. That would be fine by me. I'm not too bothered if it doesn't itself generate new analytic insights. But I think it's sort of I think if you're going to do it's more of a sort of, I suppose the fancy word is to do it in a frenetic way, to actually have those conversations and to enable people who are involved in that process to tease out the ambivalence in a way that they can get beyond developers versus community, or planners versus freedom, or suburbs versus the centre city, or that type of stuff. So it's a slightly more strategic game for it than just an analytic game.
Yeah, just has a question about, and I might have sort of missed it, but I got the impression you were mainly talking about what sort of developers said and what kind of local institutional political actors were saying. And I kind of wondered, and perhaps this is partly what you're working on now, but whether you could say a little bit more about local social movement organisations, civil society sort of groups and neighbourhood associations and so on, and whether there's any, whether they are better at exploiting the kinds of ambivalences that you're talking about at the end, or whether, I mean, you started to hint at it then in answer to Frank, but whether there was sort of, whether there was any attempts, whether it was sort of similarly closing down ambivalences, or whether there was a kind of a possibility for kind of opening them up and pushing them in an interesting direction.
In the stuff we've seen so far, I don't see that. I mean, actually, that might be another reason to go to Facebook, because you might have the conversations in there about, well, we can't just blame the developers all the time, blah, blah, blah. Or, I mean, there's one, for example, the David Chernishenko guy I mentioned, who had been a Green candidate in the national elections in the city. And, you know, is probably of all the councillors is the most fervently in favour of the city having a climate change strategy, blah, 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 blah. But he's also quite strong on, and he's a representative for the Glebe Wall, which is sort of, I don't know Manchester well enough to know the sort of demographics, but anyway, to get the analogy right. But it's the oldest of the genteel public sector affluent neighbourhoods that he can mostly represent. And so he's combining this with an argument that he makes a lot in city council meetings about people having a right to light. And so one of the reasons why he objects to condos going, you know, to say 5-storey, 6-storey buildings even going up, not just 20-storey buildings going up, is that the people around them have a right to light, which is partly articulated as an environmentalist or environmentalist aim arising out of that sort of ideology or identity, but doesn't seem to be recognising the tension or contradiction. I mean, maybe you would get that a lot more in internal conversations, but those are not always as easy to get at anyway. So, I don't. But that said, in the public strategies, you don't see a lot of the. You can tease out the contradiction that makes me think that ambivalence is a useful term, but you don't see them itself. You see them addressing it themselves directly. That said, we've got a bunch. You know, this is obvious. We've got a bunch more work to do, so it might become more obvious as we work on it more.
Other questions? Robbie first.
Hi, my name's Robbie. Thanks for the talk, really interesting. I do a PhD here at the University of Manchester, look at the moral economy of carbon offsetting.
All right.
So I was really interested in the stuff you had about carbon dieting and obesity and stuff like that. Some of that was new to me. I was wondering how you kind of came across this data, how you did that map, how you made that. I know it's a bit unfair to do multi-pronged, but there's that element, and then you sort of said you think maybe some of these could work. So in what sense do you mean that these could be workable? And this is a comment on that. To my mind, a lot of these discourses have kind of died away recently. They're much less prominent than they were in sort of 2006-07, that period of time. Do you have the same sort of perspective on that from Canada?
Well, we didn't look specifically at that stuff. And we did a paper. So we did initially a paper where we, if you like, what we wanted to do was look at initiatives that just Johannes and I was in Sweden, and where we self-consciously said what we're looking at is attempts to shape how individuals guide their own practice in relation to carbon. And so the 5 examples of that were carbon calculators as a sort of generic calculating practices, carbon footprinting, carbon offsetting, carbon dieting, and 2 others. I have these in my head, but I can't think what they are. So offsetting was one of those, and that obviously arose to stuff I was doing on carbon markets as well. And so the carbon dieting one just came up out of that as one that we thought, there's more to do on this. Then let's explore that a bit. It's quite different to something like carbon offsetting in terms of of a sort of strategy of governing individual carbon emissions, in the sense that it's really insistent on people working on their own carbon emissions rather than saying bye bye, here's your €6 for my flight type thing. So it's got a different sort of governing logic and a different subjectivity logic and so on, we thought, so we just explored it more. In terms of data, then that's mostly sort of finding as much documentary material from the organisations that self-consciously identified as doing something around carbon dieting or climate dieting, or the books and the magazine articles and all of these calculators and so on. So it was really a sort of, you can't claim to have exhausted the entire population of these initiatives. Most of them are in Europe or in North America, in terms of their base. Quite a lot of them are religious organisations that did some version of them. So you've got sort of patterns in there, but it's not like there's a register of carbon dieting organisations. Where there is a register of carbon offsetting organisations, that became much more deeply institutionalised. But I agree that a lot of that stuff, some of those initiatives have become less prominent. Even carbon offsetting, to an extent, is less prominent than it would have been, say, 5 years ago. Not sure I have a quick answer to why that might be the case. But on the first bit of the question about what do I mean by work, do they work or not? I don't mean do they work in that actually do they solve the climate change problem, because I don't. Part of the sort of premise is that there isn't a single, very important part of the premise is there is no single way that could ever occur. But if it occurs, if we manage, then it'll be the messy interaction of lots and lots of diverse things going on. Some of which are huge in terms of city planning, right up to international agreements. Some of which are micro-changing the ways that people, or trying to work out how people can change the ways that they attach meanings to different aspects of their daily lives. And so it's knowing in advance which one is the good thing to do. That's partly why also the stuff I wrote about carbon offsetting carbon markets was much more hesitant about being really hardcore down the line critical than my ideological instincts would lead me to be. Anyway.
Thanks.
Unless someone else has got a question, I'll ask the last one. Any other? Yep, Frank first.
I've got two questions on the carbon dieting as well. The first has got to do with the notion that also in normal dieting, we know that most diets fail. And people end up more obese and more fat and actually feeling guilty. So I was wondering if dieting is such a good metaphor or not in that respect, but that's a smaller point. The more important point is, I think it focuses very much on the idea that information leads to change. And of course, in the Sustainable Consumption Institute, we have heavily criticized this idea for a long time. There's very little evidence that whatever the food labels or what supermarkets have, in the sustainability area has much effect. So this seems to be in that same kind of trend of thinking. If you get people information, or the calculators that they will change. So I was just wondering if there's any sort of more political critique in your own work of this idea. It's also very individualist oriented, of course. So that's the first. And the second is more maybe with the Canadian or maybe US background, because of course the focus on the consumption side leaves the production side a bit unquestioned, and particularly Canada, which in most areas is the good boy. In the carbon, of course, is the bad boy with all the tar sands and all that. So I was a bit, don't you feel like, well, by focusing on putting the plight on the consumer, doesn't that sort of absolve the politicians and the producers from all their responsibility? Or again, a bit of a wider political question of all, because it makes me feel very uncomfortable with the things you show. Oh my God, are we going to that kind of society?
And when did you stop beating your wife?
When did you say that? The most that's about, that might be why his projects they've been on the decline, but I suppose there's an obvious reaction in the sense that I mean, at least, I mean, you might know a lot better than me, but the one common story you hear about why diets fail is that because when you're dieting and you're counting your calories, you're actually thinking about food all the time, and that might not quite transfer to the carbon in the carbon metaphor. Partly because carbon is itself more abstract, and thinking about it. It's hard for me to imagine thinking I'm going to turn the thermostat up because I'm thinking about counting my carbon. But that's the analogy. Anyway. But on the information change, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about it, and maybe it's contained mostly in that table that I only really didn't want to go through in lots of details, that, I mean, there is an informational element to them, all these myriad, incredibly detailed amounts of carbon in every single thing. But there's a lot of, I would say that it's embedded in a way of, it's as much in the minds of the people or in the strategy of the initiatives about changing people's way of orienting themselves to their daily lives as it is about accounting. It operates through the counting, but it also operates via a desire. And it's the interrelation of those two things that probably, to the extent they create any effect at all, would be that, not just the information. So I totally agree with the critique of pure information as if, you know, that's just, but I'm not sure that they're only operating via that as a strategy. The production side left out. Another part, I mean, I've only talked about a couple of things, partly because I've already started those, but one part of the grant that we've got is looking at tar sands and the mobilisation over those. And how, and also particularly, I mean, which will be a specifically Canadian project, really, so a couple of colleagues who work on Canada specifically, although I don't tend to. Looking at how, I mean, one of the papers will probably have an epigram from something like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, who routinely come up with a rhetoric about how did you get to work. And so in their strategy, a large part of their rhetorical strategy, faced with, well, apart from the fact, as was in the paper the other day, yesterday, getting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to set up anti-terrorist units to monitor anti-tar sands activists. That's one sort of strategy. But the rhetorical part of the strategy is to actually play up the ambivalence in there. Is to say, look, you can't be opposed to the tar sands because you drove to work today. And so it's precisely for them an integration of the mutual, you know, their strategy is mutual dependence of consumption on production, and to get people to close down. No, that's maybe it's to close down their own ambivalence by emphasising their dependence on oil. But it's not our intention to ignore the production side, but even though that one does. But and you are absolutely right that the individualising discourses have that, I think, absolutely problematic. Part of the analysis in our MySpace paper was precisely on that. The interesting thing, I do think, is that you do see a moment in that proliferation process where actors who don't have that individualising instinct, the urban planners, get in on the act. So it's not a sort of, I mean, that's why I sort of want to just follow these things slightly naively in a way, without being too critical too early on, because they can go in directions that the initial discourse doesn't necessarily intend.
Okay. We're going to take Luke's question as the last one, and I will ask my question to you later and then blog it. Luke. Carl. Sorry. Luke sat next to you, Carl.
Open-ended question, just out of curiosity. What role does gender play in some of these discourses? Is that something that's come through in the material that you've looked at so far? Just thinking of the tech boy kind of angle is quite an interesting one. See, there's a gendered aspect to dieting narratives that we're quite familiar with. I wonder about the intensification one as well, whether gendered relations have played a key role in that. I don't really have much more in the way of suggestion other than to, in your earlier work, patriarchy was a key sort of structural cause, so is that part of the analysis here? And then maybe ambivalence, gender ambivalence, could you see that playing a role here at all?
I think, I mean, in the automobility literature generally, there's a lot of stuff about how high sprawl automobile dependent environments are have very, very definite gender effects by reducing mobility for most women in, or for many women in suburban contexts. Again, that would be something to look at more as we get more and more of the material sort of covered. I don't, in the first cut I've done, you don't see it explicitly. At least I haven't seen it yet explicitly. But that doesn't mean it's not present implicitly. Class is more obvious in those discourses because another implicit. I mean, that implicit signifier for class of we don't like Toronto and Vancouver, too many people, too noisy. That's an implicit class discourse in my view. And the student, the anti-student narrative is often. I mean, it's sort of not at one level, but it is. I mean, it's a similar sort of social differentiation strategy of who is the normal part of the community.
Yeah. Whereas gender, you got to map that in
not
GIS mapping or something.
Not directly, no. I don't know. I don't have anything better than that.
Yes, thank you. Okay.
There's this general
The big applause going to come down in a second.
Yes.
Right. Final round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are going to be at the